The Cruziero book will be on offer again at lunch and to look at. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we will be having a lunch discussion, and the focus of the lunch, which we are providing, is on the ASM sector, and it is preceded by a session that will be wonderful, and then we will go into that discussion. So that's just a little bit about, some of what's happening. I know that Ucha will be here later. Emifa is here now, and Emifa does have some work with her, which I am excited to see. So, having said that, it's really humid out today. And I am a native New Yorker, the ultimate provincial. And I wonder if it's more humid than it was when I was growing up on the street on which I now live. And if so, why? So perhaps this next panel, which addresses not only, if you will, symptom, but action, is one of the most critical of these 2 days. So the topic is understanding climate justice and just transition. And John Mulligan from the World Gold Council, for those of you that weren't here yesterday, John is the lead sustainability officer, and he's president of the Sustainability Commission of SIPJO, and really somebody who is leading the way in thinking about these things. And one of the things that we want to also think about is what actually those words mean. With him on the panel, Shari Gittleman from Newmont, who is joining remotely. Kif Gallagher, who is executive director of the Global Heat Reduction Initiative at SCS Global, whom we're thrilled to welcome for the first time. And Rebecca Villalobos, the founder of Earthly Strategies, which is a really great name, but to pierce that a bit, she has very deep knowledge in questions of human rights, resource allocation, and now quite a burgeoning interest in climate. So, and is part of the group that is fondly and lovingly mentored by Cristina Villegas. Thanks, everybody.
Here, here.
So, good morning, everybody. Yes, and hello, Shari, again. Big head towering over all of us, but hello, good morning. So yes, I'm John Mulligan, and for those of you who've attended this event before, you may have certainly heard me talk about climate before. We're taking a slightly different angle this time. We're going to be looking at some of the possible social implications of climate, and Kif's going to offer a kind of challenge to some of the means of measuring climate. So I thought I'd start, because you've heard me speak, and we won't be talking that much about the practical application of decarbonisation strategies, net zero, etc. But let's look at the context. Where are we now? Where are we since I last spoke to some of you, at least? I think it's fair to say we've had a major shift in geopolitics and economic. Thank you for that. For those who aren't here virtually, there was a large sigh in the room when I said that. There has been, I think, a further compounding of short-termism, a rise of what we might call bilateralism, so a fragmentation of kind of global convergence, including on climate, and short-term tactical approaches rather than long-term solutions. And so we face headwinds, and we'll touch upon those. I think we've also seen a resurgence of climate change denial in some locations and jurisdictions, And let's be honest, we've seen a whiplash change in US policy and the withdrawal across the board almost in terms of certainly federal action and some of the implications, funding, research, etc. But the facts remain the same. In fact, the facts are ever more evident. And so the lived experience of climate, the ability to point to unfortunately, the damage of climate is not just now confined to equatorial regions. It is a global phenomenon. Sorry, apparently you can't hear me. Surprise. And so we wanted to talk about some of those issues. The title includes the phrase just transition and climate justice, and I will suggest what I mean by that. I'll offer some very simple definitions. But really, the overarching challenge is one of the unequal historical responsibility for climate. There are communities, there are countries that frankly are facing extreme impacts that they weren't the cause of. There is the issue of what does the transition mean in terms of populations, workforces. If you move to a decarbonized economy, might you be disadvantaging, if I could say that, those that are vulnerable, marginalized? How do you bring along populations, employees, etc., with you on the decarbonization journey? And then there is the issue of, well, that includes, of course, protecting livelihoods, and that's often how it's framed. Certainly if you're talking in developing economies, if you're talking to the ministers of, for instance, several African nations, they will be talking about how do you protect employment when employment is already a challenge? How do you compensate for the fact that they can't use fossil fuel resources to sustain their economies? So that's the kind of big picture. But then on the climate justice side, there's also the issue of climate affecting people who are already vulnerable. And this is somewhat an evolution of a discussion around evolution of pollution and environmental impacts on marginalized and vulnerable people. And so we're going to try and touch upon some of those things at least. I started with this kind of brief summary of the current context. And I'm mindful we have somebody, who lives in New York, who is therefore, it's you. And so I thought I'd ask, for your comment on the very local context, but also clearly the US context.
Yeah. I mean, for my sons, I also lived in Washington, D.C. before, so Kif, I actually love D.C., so we can talk about that later. For those I don't know, Rebecca Villalobos. Lisa, thank you for that fantastic introduction, and I'm always happy to be here. And I remember last year we had the first human rights panel, which was really excellent, and or first official human rights panel, so it's really cool to see this kind of confluence of factors. So just a bit of brief context about me. 15 years ago, really started my career working in places like Cambodia and Myanmar with people at the base of the economic pyramid and like fashion supply chains. This way. And over time spent a lot of time with upstream communities, in my NGO life, and ended up working closely with Christina and others in mining affected communities, and then have spent sort of like the second half of my career journey, or the latest portion, really working with downstream companies who are trying to understand what are some of the impacts that they're making on climate, what are the levers that they have, what's their responsibility, and a lot of conversation that is coming up is both from the human rights and the environmental perspective. So I share that because, yes, I'm based here in New York. I've spent a lot of time, my happy place is with like mining communities, and I spend a lot of time with downstream companies. And so I'm not speaking on behalf of any of them, just to be clear, or of any of my previous employers, let's just put that out there. But I do want to say that the culture around climate, I was just in Valencia last week, And it's like anyone who's been in Europe the past month, we've had like record heat wave, right? We are literally, we cannot, it's funny that we have climate denial because we literally cannot deny the effects that we're all feeling today. And then I think, in another type of climate, when we think about the operating context and the political climate, we're seeing that many companies who, frankly, are afraid to be seen as out of line with the US administration, are removing words from their annual reports, from broader communications around just transition, many of them, because they fear, frankly, retribution. And I think that in some cases that is like very valid, and we're seeing the effects of that. And so we have this, we're at this sort of, tipping point, and I know that many of the climate scientists, and I won't speak to the heat stress part, I'll leave that to you, Kif, have been talking about this for quite some time, of these different sort of biodiversity and climate tipping points. But we're also at this tipping point sort of within the culture where we now, to meet our climate goals, we know according to IEA reports that we basically have to mine more minerals than we ever have, right, to meet, even thinking about green technology. And at the same time, people are experiencing the effects more than they ever have, and those vulnerable people are, whether it's like heat stress or other types of livelihood loss, they're already experiencing those effects and will continue. And then from a company perspective, while we're in this moment that we really need to meet, many companies, at least US-based companies, are feeling the pressure to either do less or say less. So we're really at this interesting moment where we all should be coming together and saying, like, it's time to get it together, it's time to take action. But instead, in fact, we are now having to navigate really a new world order. Yes, the world does not revolve around Donald Trump, no matter what he or others may think. And at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that we're really operating in a new kind of economic world order. And that has serious implications for people who are trying to drive climate justice solutions. We cannot necessarily rely on USG, not that we could previously, US government, but now it's more in spite of that, whatever the opposite of enabling is, I guess prohibitive regulatory environment, like now we must actually work around US government to move some of these things forward. And the last thing I'll say, John, is all is not lost. Dr. Ayanna Johnson wrote this amazing book called What If We Got It Right? And I think it's really important for anyone to read and to be thinking about like the future we could create. And I know we want to spotlight some of the things, like work is still happening, and it will continue to because it needs to. So,
thanks for that. And I'm not going to comment on the US situation. But what I would say is, in London Climate Week a few weeks ago, it was the most energized and perhaps optimistic London Climate Week that I've participated in. And there were a lot of US participants.
I'm sure.
As you say, there's, I think, almost a galvanizing force that we know we've got headwinds, new obstacles. So actually, I came away from London Climate Week, perhaps for the first time, optimistic, which was surprising. So, as you say, there's work to be done. I'm just going to
so all of the Americans will just be latching on to that energy, that optimism. Thank you.
But I'm going to follow up on a few things you mentioned, because you mentioned your experience in mining communities, and you mentioned also the perception from downstream. Can you just comment on the kind of implications, the intersection between some of the kind of human rights and social issues, perhaps community issues, and that perception of the need for action and what it means in practice?
Rephrase it. Say it one more different way.
Okay. Can you comment on the community and human rights implications of the need for continued action?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is that we're always looking at from within it, and I'd love to hear Kif and Sherry's comments as well. Sorry, Sherry, I keep forgetting you're actually hovering over my shoulder, which is right where I want you, actually, in all scenarios. But in terms of just transition, what's interesting is that people are already suffering these impacts, and so when we think about action that's taken, we think about mitigation and adaptation. you know, and sort of, if you're talking to a lay person, it's like, how do you make it less bad, and then how do you live with whatever consequences there are in terms of adaptation? How do you find a way to adapt to that? And so we've seen that, you know, many communities are already forced to adapt to sort of the current environment, and many of them, I mean, honestly, it's interesting, even in this country, right? Last week, all of these floods in Texas, all of these different things, those aren't mining communities, but those are still affected people. Anyway, so communities around the world, be it in Indonesia, be it in, you know, Ghana, be it in other places, have been suffering these impacts. And at the same time, what's interesting is that we also have to consider the impacts that occur as a result of us taking action. And so what I'm saying here is, you know, there's this saying that, maybe you all know this, it's like, the transition is inevitable, but like how fair it is not. There's someone has said it in a much nicer way. But basically, you know, we want things fast and fair. We know we have to go fast, but the fairness part is really what's up to debate. So I say that because these communities are already, you know, feeling the effects of this. What we do about it now, the way that we extract minerals, the way, you know, Estelle, I'm thinking a lot about your conversation yesterday around value creation. And we've seen sustainability and climate mitigation as a cost center, when we really should be thinking about it as value addition, as shared prosperity as well. So these communities are really suffering, or have suffered many of the consequences without many of the benefits. And now we have a chance to do things a bit differently. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but happy to expound.
It sets up the next question perfectly. So Shari, we mentioned mining communities, we mentioned, you know, practical actions, and certainly when it comes to adaptation and resilience, they are localized issues. You have to look at the local situation. I know Newmont operates in multiple contexts, multiple countries. Can you just comment about some of that locationally specific, community-specific implications from your perspective?
Sure. First of all, great to be with you again today. My preference is to be in the room and not be the floating head, as I said yesterday. But I'm listening to Lisa this morning, and I'm actually pretty glad I'm here in Denver, Colorado. I mean, I checked and it was 69 degrees. My AC is off, the window is open. It is going to get up to 80 today. But Colorado is actually quite lovely and magical in the summertime. So anyway, but I'm with you in staying cool, and I'll send some of my mountain cool air your way. Yeah, John, great question. Let me talk a little bit about what we've done to look at climate adaptation and transition around our mine sites. So all of our mine sites have done climate impact assessments. Like Rebecca, I sit on the social human rights side. I'm not in our environmental team of our company. That work has been led by our environmental teams. And from that work, they've looked at our operations and come up with climate adaptation roadmaps. We're in a process of developing those for each of our mine sites. But what those studies really didn't do, and this is then where the social department, our social performance team, gets involved and says, hey, did we look outside the fence? What are going to be all the things that happen outside our operations? I know we're dealing with how the mine's going to operate and how our employees are going to get to work and how we're going to manage those issues. What's happening outside the fence? What is government doing? What government plans are in place? So we did a pilot community resilience assessment at 2 of our mine sites, one in Peru and one in Australia. So this is good because it kind of gets at 2 very different countries and local situations and what we found. So what we did was stakeholder mapping, some stakeholder interviews, then really looked at what government plans were in place, what were the things already there, and then did some scenario planning, taking the work the environmental team had done on the top 3 climate impacts. How do those then play out in the community? How does it impact health, livestock, agriculture, property, right? We started to look at all of those impacts because our mine operates in that local context. So it's going to impact our operations as well at the end of the day. So what we found was very interesting. It was quite different between the 2 sites. In Peru, there was a lot of information on climate adaptation. There's a lot of international aid money that had gone into Peru, a lot of people looking at climate. So we even saw for the Cajamarca region where we operate, they had a regional Adaptation Plan was first drafted in 2016. When we go to Australia, things were managed more at a national level, really relied on the party in power. Things were more stop and go. And in 2024, Australia developed their first national adaptation plans. It's like very different government context. In Australia, it's much more about, it's a developed economy, it's a more resilient place. Hey, it's up to people and companies to figure it out on the ground and regionally, but really there wasn't the same kind of level of work done. So when we looked at Australia, extreme heat, we're located in Western Australia, and I know Kif's going to talk about extreme heat, which would be great, but extreme heat's the issue, right? So then we start to look at what are the impacts in the community and thinking about the things that the mine supports. So our community investment programs, but we're probably going to see higher attendance at the swimming pool. People are going to be coming to the public library. We're going to see wildfires and property damage and biodiversity loss. And so how do we then, work as a partner with communities when we can see those impacts coming? In Peru, it's quite different. The Cajamarca region is 44% of the population is below the poverty level, right? So you've got much more vulnerable population. You've got really small scale farmers. You've got more migration into that area. And so you're just dealing with a more vulnerable base of people. So we saw way more impacts that we think will be seen around livelihoods and health and water. The impacts in Peru are just rainfall variability, right? People are already saying the dry season is now becoming much longer, but then they're getting a ton of rain when they get a lot of rain. One of the things that was really interesting that none of us had thought about when we looked at the scenario planning in Peru was potatoes are the main crop in the region where we are. As we start to see challenges with potato farming or new pests that have entered and those knock-on effects, we're probably going to see more people look to do artisanal mining as well. And I thought that would be an interesting fact for this group. But, you're going to see shifts in things. Artisanal mining is not impacted by climate in the same way, right? And people are looking for a way to make ends meet and get by. So I just thought it was a really important finding that none of us had actually really thought about as we look at these trends. And I think that's probably true in many parts of the world outside of this community in Peru. So, what do we do with this work? It's really there to have a dialogue and be part of our stakeholder engagement. So how do we, I guess in mining, a lot of times we engage with communities. It's around impacts we're directly having and what are those mitigation plans. Climate, we've definitely contributed to it, but it's much bigger than one company or something that we've solely impacted, right? So we're part of it, but it's not something we are 100% the cause of. So I think it really positions us more as a partner with governments and with communities to have that discussion. But we also want to take these results and say, what have we missed? Is there anything in our current community investment programs or our mitigation plans that we really haven't layered on this climate lens and thought through, hey, this is going to impact livelihood restoration for farmers that are resettled? How are we laying that climate lens into our current mitigation plans? Because otherwise we're just being reactive, right? So it's really helping us to think a little bit longer term and have those discussions with people today. And a lot of times stakeholders are aware and talking about it, but if they're not, there's also an opportunity for us to share the work we've done and share that assessment and say, hey, this is one of the main concerns for this area. How do we work with you? Or how do we change this program? Or how do we better prioritize our community investments to help support that resiliency?
Can I build on that, actually? Because that kind of, you asked me, what are some of the impacts? And I kind of talked about, yes, it's not just the impacts now, but the things that we do also create impacts on these communities. But, Sherry, to your point, in many other countries, I've seen exactly the same thing. You're seeing, when we think about the most vulnerable, we think about the elderly, we think about people with disabilities, whether seen or unseen. We think about, single income households, people who are already sort of vulnerable. And, in terms of thinking about, I think agriculture is really, really important to call out, because I know many times within the ASM community even, right, we're trying to get artisanal and small scale miners to go into farming, right? We're like, forget your gold, go, farm potatoes, et cetera. And so it's interesting to think about that, because in many ways, those livelihoods aren't necessarily maybe even may not be available to them in the long term. So I'm definitely seeing that, I think particularly as you think about women, you know, and the health of a family. And what I've seen in particular, kind of two areas, are the stress on the natural environment, on the actual natural resources, be that, you know, for livelihoods, or be that in, you know, actually mitigating the further effects of climate change. And then really the structural, like the local structural system, be it healthcare, be it education, be it, you know, things that have to do with unemployment and economic assistance, are also put under immense stress, because they basically were not built to, you know, handle this level of effect. So Sherry, thanks. You helped me answer my question. I totally agree.
Thanks both. And there's a couple of points I'd like to come back to in a second. That issue of alternative livelihoods, because it's also tied in mining communities with legacy, in terms of legacy impacts, and building resilience, and you mentioned agriculture. But first of all, Shari also mentioned extreme heat. You know, to some extent, I'm feeling it today. Certainly, I made the mistake of walking here. Never walk 10 blocks in New York. Extreme heat. But you have a kind of challenge, I think, in terms of how we currently capture or measure the impacts of heat, or how we measure the drivers, shall we say, of heat. And that presumably has implications for then how we plan and act. Do you want to just say a bit more about the challenge to our measurements and the implications?
Sure. Thanks, John. And let me first I'm Kif Gallagher from the Global Heat Reduction Initiative at SCS Global Services. I just want to thank Lisa for giving me an opportunity to meet some of the great folks in this community. I didn't think I was from this industry, but now that I've spoken to a few folks that are into mentorship and artistry and making, and then other business folks that are executives, I can see that there's a lot of overlap, and I've had some amazing conversations, so thank you for having me. Extreme heat. I liked when Sherry said it's about the heat. I'm sometimes reminded of, if some folks know the political operative James Carville. He said it was about the economy, stupid. And it's funny that in our personal conversations, and already it's come up 5 times this morning, we talk about the heat, the oppressive heat, the humidity, and what we're going through. I'm in DC, you know, probably already had 8 to 10 days where you literally just probably shouldn't be outside at all. Lisa, it was not like this when we were growing up. It's clearly a lot worse. We have already been exceeding consistently some of the most aggressive projections of heat, and overshot 1.5, and it looks like it's going to hang out here and continue to rise. So it's about the heat, stupid. And we talk about emissions, but we don't always connect it to heat, which is ironic if you think about it, because emissions is a derivative. It's sort of like one step removed. If we curb those, then we affect heat. And while that's true, 50% of warming is caused not by CO2, but by superpollutants. And scientifically, or short-lived superpollutants, often called short-lived climate forcers or short-lived climate pollutants, but superpollutants has seemed to just this year have caught the imagination more than the sort of eye glazer of short-lived climate forcers, which wasn't quite punching through. Only 5% of climate finance actually goes to address superpollutant mitigation. So if you think about that gap, 50% of the heat is being driven by superpollutants, only 5% of mitigation investments from countries and from companies are going to actually mitigate this. So that's a problem. And I'm reminded of the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. And to get back to your question, John, we're just not measuring what matters most right now. And the fact is that these superpollutants are tens to hundreds to thousands of times more potent as heat drivers than CO2 over the critical near term. Rebecca, you brought up climate tipping points. collapse of the Amazon, the melting of the ice sheets. This is what's happening right now. What's critical is that we build a bridge between now and 2050 that will enable us to get to a decarbonized world. Let's just say we're able to decarbonize by 2050. How do we get there? We think it's tough now. What do we think it's going to be in 5 years? Forget about 25 years. And by the way, the current climate metric model measures 100 years, and most people don't know that. That's one of the biggest problems. And what do I mean by that? The metric that is used in measuring climate impact is CO2, carbon dioxide equivalence, which is measured over GWP 100, which is its global warming potential over 100. So it takes the basket of greenhouse gases and it measures it over 100 years, and then you come up with this ton of CO2 that is the metric that we all use when we're buying carbon credits, when we're getting our carbon footprint. The problem is that methane, which is 150 times more potent, up to 150 times more potent, while it's in the atmosphere, is only in the atmosphere for 11 years. So you throw a 100-year denominator on that, and it kind of gets mushed out and undervalued. HFCs, similarly, thousands of times more potent than CO2e, HFCs from refrigerants, F-gases. And they are also short-lived, and so they're minimized. And so it undervalues those critical pollutants that we need to focus on, John. The other thing is that it completely overlooks aerosols, black carbon, tropospheric ozone, which is a heavy word, but it's basically smog. Black carbon is soot, comes from combustion, and open burning and diesel and these types of things. Again, thousands of times more potent, only in the atmosphere for actually a few days to a couple weeks. But when you're constantly emitting them, it creates this hot blanket. There's some complexity around black carbon and some of the cooling factors that are often co-emitted with black carbon, which I won't get into. But there are many pure sources of black carbon that are driving that heat. So the two big problems is you're not measuring what you need to manage, and the current model is inadequate in that regard. Now, I just want to finalize, say that we do need to remove carbon, and we do need that long-term goal. We do need to protect nature, right? It does a whole lot of things other than cool the planet and balance our ecosystem, or it's trying desperately and struggling and failing in a lot of ways right now. And in fact, having reverse effects where when it used to be drawing down climate, it's now emitting methane and other things, whether it's from ice, whether it's from wetlands, et cetera. So you're seeing the effects now. So when I think about climate justice and just transition, I'm not just thinking about curbing emissions. I'm thinking about when, where, and how we do it. And I can talk more about that if you have further questions.
Yeah, thanks. And I remember being at one of the COPs, COP28, I think it was, and they said, what was the positives come out of COP? And I remember saying it was probably the agreement on methane, but there was an agreement to cut methane. Everybody was going to look at it. I think last week I read that methane sat, or the satellite which measures methane, has mysteriously disappeared. Yeah. It's mysteriously gone. So it was reporting, really, and not to be too scary, it was reporting that methane measurements had grossly underestimated methane that was being pumped out. And suddenly the satellite disappears, so the measurement of methane is a real challenge. Sorry, I hate to throw scary science or scary facts in there, because I do think we need to look at opportunities and positivities, which I'm going to pass to you again. What's the opportunity? What is the implication if we do start to measure and act?
Well, first of all, there is a way to right the ship a bit in a complementary model that includes the CO2e 100-year measurement, which again is crucial, but adds this additional critical data for companies and countries and even individuals to target their mitigation activities in sort of a portfolio. We're going to take a long-term approach. We're going to invest in direct removal, if you will, or technological removal solutions. We're going to protect nature, but we're also going to channel investments into getting us to 2050 and beyond, which means curbing these super pollutants. And so We are advancing at SES Global and through the initiative that I lead, the Global Heat Reduction Initiative, what we call total climate accounting. I like to think of it as CO2e plus, where we don't have to move everybody into another random metric based on radiative forcing and things that just aren't going to happen right now. But keep the metric that we have and simply add this additional data with respect to all heat drivers, the gases, the aerosols, and even non-emission factors such as reflectivity. You know, people talk about the rainforest as the lungs of the planet. We also need to think of the Himalayas as the great, solar reflector for the planet. Right now, there's a lot of ash falling on it, and it's contaminating the water and affecting food systems, but it's also dampening that reflectivity, which is actually one of the fastest, most effective ways to lower local heat, is using reflective surfaces on roofs and roadways to actually address local heat. And so you see mayors and you see folks that are really responsible for lives on the ground doing it, but they're not getting any credit for it, if you will, in terms of what the heat reduction implications are. So we're advancing total climate accounting. It measures all drivers. And the second critical thing that it does other things, but I won't get into right now, but the second most critical thing that it does is it provides heat implication data over any time frame. So let's just say you're one of the 10,000 companies that's aligning their goals with science-based target initiatives, or if you're one of the 96 countries that's targeting 2050 temperature limitation in 25 years away, then it allows you to accelerate heat reduction on these critical milestones, 2030, 2040, 2050. So that's the approach that we're suggesting. And then imagine if you could compare carbon credits and greening your roof versus electrifying your fleet versus diverting organic waste, and you're able not to just look in tons of CO2e, but you're able to look in terms of tons of CO2e, what the cost is going to be for my company, and what the near-term heat implications are for each of these investments. And what we found in our studies is that in a lot of cases, it costs less or equal to accelerate and slow the rate of warming.
So that kind of cost reduction aspect, I think, is key to be articulated. Because as we say, people just, again, see this as a burden and a cost.
Right.
And actually, they don't look at the long-term opportunity, and we will hopefully touch upon that if there's time. One more comment before I move on from you, hopefully, is do you consider the kind, you mentioned it already in terms of cities and progressive mayors, do you consider the social implications, and I say the opportunities at that level, at the social kind of, the human level?
All the time. I mean, I think Rebecca and Sherry have spoken eloquently to that, but people are suffering now, and in a lot of ways they haven't been heard at the degree that they need to be. And, it's ironic that Europe and the U.S. is now experiencing this, and I think that, hopefully we'll be able to pick up in COP30 where we left off in COP28 and move forward. But people have been suffering for a long time. Extreme heat and pollution are the biggest environmental killers, and pollution is driven by aerosols, and heat is driven by superpollutants. So it is, if you're thinking about climate justice, we have to not just think about curbing emissions, but how fast are we doing it?
Yeah, and I always, because it always sounds a bit scary, this stuff, and it is scary. But I always look at the action that was taken in terms of the ozone layer and CFCs as a success story. We can change and we can have a positive impact on what was then seen as a significant threat.
That's right. The Montreal Protocol and the Kigali Amendment are considered the most effective interventions. And there's a new initiative that's popping up right now that we're sort of sisters or friends with, I suppose, from a group of folks who are trying to bring that same tactic to methane and other things. Yeah.
Excellent. Christine wanted to say something, I think. Is there a mic?
Sorry, and I just want to add on, I
Please,
think,
welcome.
never shy to give my opinion or my perspective. One, I think we should have a follow-up, and Kif, I think you should do like a heat stress 101 for anyone. I'm signing you up for after this panel and the coffee break. I think a lot of these terms are a bit like inside baseball, right? We're using a lot of very technical terms, and I think that's partly the challenge sometimes, is that within the climate space, we've kind of forgotten to talk like a person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so even I was, Climate Week last year, I remember I attended an event, and instead of, it was like extreme weather events instead of natural disasters, but they were thinking about, what's some of the language that will resonate with people. So I just say that because I actually think that's part of the challenge as to why people don't see as many bright spots, because they don't understand them. They don't understand what a big deal that is, like COP28, how we landed on methane. If I told my sister that, she'd be like, okay, great, Rebecca, like, fantastic. That doesn't mean much to me. And so I think a lot of times it's also like meeting people where they are and being able to sort of decode and help people understand where those points, those progress points actually are.
It's a really good point, and I was also going to make it myself, that the facts and the science, no, thank you, the facts and the science actually don't change people's opinions. You have to talk in a way that is emotionally resonant and means something to people's lives. So I heartily agree. Christina.
Yeah, I guess on that point, one of my questions is, okay, how do people in this room respond in their own work? So how do we move forward? And Kif, I want to ask you in particular, if I might interpret something that you said, your comments. Would it be accurate to say that the biggest thing they can do is to, companies in this room, is to focus on their own heat sources and accounting of their own, like scope 1, for example, and maybe you can say what scope 1 is. Because we can not be insider baseball or football or whatever it is.
Soccer.
Yeah, football. And then if I can just insert my agenda. And it is, some of the poorest people in this world had the least to do with the warming of it. And I am very deeply concerned about and this has nothing to do with you, obviously, but the weaponization of sustainability against some of the poorest people in this world. And so one thing that I convinced GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, to fund, and they did, and it's ongoing, is a study to measure the carbon emissions and the GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, of artisanal and small-scale mining of gemstones in East Africa, and to segment that into artisanal, semi-mechanized, and well-mechanized sites. So we actually have data on people who are barefoot, using shovels and picks and human strength and walking to work, and then people who are using a generator, maybe taking a motorcycle to work or walking, and then people who are definitely taking a motorcycle, definitely using diesel, and most likely doing a lot of emissions, but in a dry savanna environment. But those are very different profiles, right? And then you can estimate your emissions if you actually know your supplier. But all this is to say is that what can we do once we know that data? We can act with data-driven. We have data-driven solutions, and we actually lean in with these communities if that's what we want to do. Again, who's the villain here? Is it us sitting in this room, or is it them way off over there? And can we create green jobs in the places that are actually affected most? So that's my agenda. I'm just going to say it very clearly. And watch that data that we publish at the end of the year is with PACT. I'm no longer with PACT, but I have access to the data. But Kif, I'd love to know that your kind of action-oriented recommendations for people in this room on their supply chains.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of, I heard, I think, a few questions in there. I think the first one was related to big companies. And of course, companies are doing what they got to do for the global economy, and the regulatory regimes within which they operate are what they are. But if you're looking at what the fastest and most effective thing would be to do, it would be to influence the standards. Let's start there, that companies are following, whether it's the Science-Based Target Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so that there's some third-party agreed-upon standard that motivates them to tighten up their operations. And yes, identify, to your first question, the blind spots in their supply chains. Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, they're all just different ways that you're using energy, and the last one being your full value chain and your suppliers and that type of thing. But yes, looking across their full net impact, if you will, and identifying the blind spots, and then bringing more intelligence and efficiency to their limited investments, okay? With respect to artisanal, again, I'm not an expert in this. I'm nowhere near where others are, but there's burning, there's coal burning, there's lanterns at night that are emitting black carbon, and there's technologies to address those. New cook stove technologies just coming out now that can make a big difference. On the bigger mining operations, you obviously have methane through rock fissures and being released, and that's just par for the course. But when they think about mitigation, there's a movement around what they call like-for-like offsetting, where if I'm a major emitter of super pollutants, then when I'm looking at different carbon credits or different mitigation opportunities, then I'm going to try to balance my portfolio of investments to reflect what I'm actually putting into the world. At the human level, I think everybody's in a different situation. I think there's EVs have their own challenges, but stopping combustion wherever you can, heat pumps, all the stuff we typically hear about. Refrigerants is a good place to focus too, and modernizing any type of refrigerants you might have. So if I could just say one thing, I'm sorry, about this comment about making the language more human. I gotta tell you, when I came to SES, the scientific basis for total climate accounting was worked on for well over a decade and peer reviewed by the UN convened Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and is actually reflective of the consensus findings of the IPCC. And the fact is that the IPCC, which is a bunch of scientists that kind of tell the world where we're headed and what we need to do, has been talking about heat from day one. They use the term radiative forcing, measured in watts per square meter, jargon, blah, 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 blah. They've been doing it since AR2. We're about to release the annual assessment, AR7. They're still talking about it, but this is why commercialization matters. I mean, sometimes I run into people being like, but wait, you're a private business. How could you be talking about this thing like you need to be an NGO in WRI? And it's like, okay, but this has been sitting there for the last few decades, and we're not doing it because of that gap. And that's why we call ourselves heat reduction, because it's about the heat. Stupid people get it. I'll be quiet.
I do think there's one thing we haven't mentioned yet as well, within like a company's operations, and that is the procurement of renewable electricity and renewable energy projects around the world, whether people are looking at carbon offset projects or now even thinking about the biodiversity credit market, et cetera. And so thinking about that, everyone and their brother wants to have a virtual power purchase agreement. We should speak, I'm gonna speak like a human. We don't need to talk about that right now. But the point is, everyone wants, all of these companies in line with their emissions targets are looking at the procurement of, renewable electricity or on-site renewables. And then as well, from an offset perspective, they're typically looking at high quality, offset projects. What's interesting is that I think the human element of that has not always been factored in. Does that community want that renewable project there? Are they benefiting from it? You know, really amazing organizations like the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has done a lot of work on shared prosperity models, indigenous-led, you know, sort of ownership or co-ownership of these renewables projects. So I think for me also, if you're a company in this room and you're purchasing any type of offset or you're looking at these projects to invest in, that's also something to look at. You know, where, of course, where are your own operations or broader value chain, but also what data do you have around the social implications of that renewable project? Because not all of those projects are created equally, in my opinion. Kif, maybe you disagree.
Thank you both. And I think the question about the weaponization of sustainability is a big one, a challenging one. I think that there's a question about action and what action needs to be taken everywhere. And obviously it is locationally specific and it is locationally sensitive. That said, we know that you mentioned artisanal mining. There has been some work on artisanal gold mining, and actually the emissions are higher than we thought because it's just all diesel. And if it's any mechanization at all, it's just a lot of diesel for relatively small production sites. So there is a challenge. There's questions in the room, and I'm aware of them, so please, I'm not ignoring you. But I think I'd like to come to Shari because I'm not asking you to comment about the decarbonisation strategy, Shari, but I know that Newmont, you mentioned purchasing power, but in the case of many gold mines, they have to generate power. They have to be the people who actually pay for the renewable themselves and bring that technology into an area. But also, there is the community implications of power generally, who's in terms of livelihoods, how much diesel is being used, can you bring in microgrids, and just as we say, the kind of broader human aspect of some of those actions. Shari, do you want to mention, you know, from your perspective and Newmont's perspective, some commentary on that broader implication in terms of again, really about communities?
I told John, I'm like, I'm not the environmental person, so remember that. No, but one of the things we've done is develop a set of principles actually around just transition. So if we're looking at a renewables project or we're looking at an adaptation plan, in mining, we have a lot of what we call our stage gate project development processes. So each stage of a project, there are certain things you have to do on environmental and social and ethics and engineering aspects of a project, right? So what we've done is to build in a climate justice or just transition, you know, category within that stage gate that starts to ask questions about inclusion, impacts on jobs, education and awareness around the issues, right? So if we're developing these type of projects, it's not just the engineering to build a solar project, but have we now also looked and thought through the kind of the human impacts and putting people in the center of that. So that's something new and something we're just, you know, have developed and put into our standards. We'll roll out as those projects come up. So I'd say it's still new enough that I can't really share how I've seen it work in action, but just trying to get people to ask those questions, right? I think we've kind of learned by stuff moving forward, and that's to Rebecca's point, like, was the due diligence done? Have we done that stakeholder engagement part of it? But I also want to say I really appreciate the comments on decoding. I talked a bit about Peru earlier, and I was just in Peru last month and spoke with the team, and I was like, so give me some examples of how you guys are engaging with the community on climate, some of the things you've done. And what's really interesting is so much of this work around resilience, and I think just community empowerment, you know, we're doing the work, but maybe we're not labeling it, right, as climate engagement. So let me give an example of that. We have a microcredit savings group in Peru. There's 500 of them. There are 9,000 people participating, and over 60% are women, right? So you want to talk about vulnerable people who are going to be facing the brunt of impacts, especially when we're talking about water issue in Peru, right? We're talking about rainfall variability. So we did an impact assessment of these savings groups, and the team came back and said, you know, actually had a way bigger impact than we thought. In terms of income generation, people participating, their incomes went up by 40%, which is amazing. But the really cool stuff that came out of it was what you started to see were people diversifying their economic activity. right? So again, we talk about climate coming in and having impacts on water, agriculture, or just how people get by. People can take a little bit more risk when they had these savings groups created. So I visited a rose nursery. Roses are not a traditional crop in Cajamarca, but they are in Ecuador, right? Ecuador is one of the largest producers of cut flowers and roses. And these guys are in a very similar climate and altitude. And so had gone into creating this rose nursery, and we're exporting them outside of Peru, but we're exporting them to a different market within the country, to a different province. So just examples like that, that you see people doing when they have a little bit of support, they're coming up with their own solutions. It's also not us coming in saying, oh, here's, what you need to do. Yes, we can help to educate about water use and energy use and renewable options, but really people have to come up with those solutions themselves. But the other cool thing, because I was kind of like, I know we do these savings groups, how is it a climate resilience, project? But really the social cohesion that comes from that group. So if somebody hits a hardship and somebody's crop doesn't turn out, you've got that circle to lean on. You've got those pooled resources. So I just think we need to think more creatively about how we're talking about resilience and how we're supporting communities. And it's not all these like, okay, everybody now needs to be, using renewable energy sources. Other things we're doing with communities and people to help them innovate and problem solve and bear through this. So I just wanted to raise that as an example. And I know we talked a lot about heat, but water for us is very, and for a lot of communities, like water is the thing I hear about before I hear about heat. So.
Thanks. We've been looking at, I spent a long time looking at the decarbonisation and the practicalities of, decarbonising mines, etc. But in the last 2 years, we've been looking more at adaptation, resilience, and nature. And the more and more you look at them, you realise you have to come up with holistic solutions. I mean, that's I think the future is we start to look at this as integrated solutions rather than one problem, one response. There was a question in the room, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Oops. So I'm Jen Maraschino with Pure Earth, global nonprofit addressing mercury pollution connected to ASGM. So I'm definitely not an expert on climate change, but I did want to just comment because I think both Rebecca and Sherry mentioned that ASGM will be a growing livelihood, right? And maybe in some connection to issues around climate change and drought and other livelihoods becoming not viable. So certainly just want to kind of highlight that. I think you both had mentioned that we are going to continue to have the ASGM community growing. And in some cases, that work is going to be taking place in vulnerable places like the Amazon rainforest, right? In Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and other places. But I wanted to share that there are some really interesting solutions taking place with these communities that connect to climate change. And as an organization, we're focused on them more because of the incentives that they may have to transition miners away from the use of mercury. But they also have positive climate impacts. For example, we're beginning pilot projects in Madre de Dios where miners are implementing solar panels to generate their mercury-free technology, such as shaking tables. And the miners are interested in that because it saves them on fuel costs, right? So there's a very positive reason for them to switch from a business perspective. So they're not necessarily thinking about the climate impact changes. For them, it's a really, and the reason we're involved is it's another wonderful incentive for them to transition away from the use of mercury. So some of these projects are just starting as pilot projects, and I think we'd be very interested in collaborating with the right people to figure out how we collect the right data and how we expand these solutions. Because what we do see is within communities, once miners see that something's working for their fellow miners, they're very interested in transitioning as well. And then also around reforestation, I think that it's a little scary for a lot of people within the industry to think about the ASGM that's happening in the Amazon rainforest, right? It's a critical place. But just highlighting that many of these miners are very interested in learning how to reforest their degraded concessions, right? That's a big part of the work that we're doing. And again, it's not for the climate change aspects. For us, it's providing these really important skills to the miners. They need to ecologically closed their concessions to remain formalized in many of these places. So working with them to train them in that reforestation component is a critical piece of our work. So I guess maybe the question in there just lies to continue to hear from you all about how the industry might be interested in engaging with the NGOs and the miners in implementing these solutions that could have some really positive climate impacts.
Thanks. I can see Rebecca was nodding vigorously. Do you have any comments, Rebecca?
So, yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And actually, I was nodding and I was thinking about what Sherry said, and also my comment in speaking like a person, and that oftentimes I think we just overcomplicate it. And you know, climate project, that is a climate project, or it has climate benefits. But at the end of the day, like, a miner is a business person, right? And at the end of the day, we're all trying to like take care of ourselves and our families and like be happy. And I think that if we can connect solutions back to that and help create those incentives that also have the climate benefits, like it's a win. I also wanted to say one thing, in that I very much appreciate being on this panel and being able to share what I know, you know, as a North American about best practices and shared prosperity models, but obviously I'm no substitute for someone who's like an actual indigenous person or from the global South. So, you know, just kind of, I acknowledge that. That's like not quite the elephant in the room, but it's there, it's sitting with me, and would love to hear from anyone else who is, you know, has been experiencing, you know, climate change, just transition impacts in their jurisdiction.
Thanks. There was a few more questions.
Can I interject?
Yeah, please. Please first. Right.
Oh,
Please.
me, okay. Just quickly to say, I think to that point that was made about also technology, I think one of the cool things with, you know, you see a lot of different examples in international development is you kind of jump the line in terms of technology, right? So you have to, like, if the household has not been hooked up, you know, to electricity on a grid, you can actually make that jump to solar, and people adapt to it and get used to it and aren't expecting, you know, light switch. They can adapt to a newer technology. Just to say, I think in our community development projects that we do, taking that angle and looking if there are those opportunities to introduce cleaner energy sources or new and more efficient technologies is always a great opportunity to do that. So just to chime in and supporting the comments made.
Thanks. We have a question.
Thank you. Gina Amato, Alliance for Responsible Mining. So I just wanted to mention two things, because perhaps it's important to look at it from a different perspective. And when I say at it is, when you said that artisanal small-scale miners are the ones who have the higher footprint, maybe we have to look at it.
I don't think we ever said that. I don't think anybody mentioned ASM having a higher footprint.
I think Christina was making a comment around the use of diesel. So
Yeah.
I do actually think that someone did say that, but I don't think it was.
I said diesel.
Right, yeah. Diesel, yeah, no, it's okay.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So, yeah, no, but I want to elaborate a little bit on that topic, because at the end of the day, from the Alliance of Responsible Mining, we've been doing a lot of work in measuring the carbon footprint, but also in reducing it. And you have to look at it from a different perspective, and it's how many people are being employed by this, by mining. So when you change the way you arrive to these numbers, you understand it's not as high, and perhaps with the right incentives and the right technology adoption that we are carrying out at the moment, it's really easy to lower those emissions. So that was one thing I wanted to mention, that it's feasible at the moment, and with the changes in the laws and with the more accessibility to these technologies, we can manage that and we can achieve that. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about also, it's about how worried these communities are because of climate change as well. And more and more people cannot continue, you know, growing their crops in these lands. So they have been pushed to start or continue more and more, because most of these communities are not just mining communities, but there are agro-mining communities. So, but they cannot spend 3 days doing agricultural because there's no access to water, or there's too much, I don't know, landslides and, you know, all of these environmental impact. So we need to also put the lens on how climate change is affecting these communities and why they are being pushed to go to other places that they were not using before. And that's a high risk, not just for the Amazon, but for any other environment, you know, ecosystem due to this push. So we have to think also on how to invest wisely, to see how we can invest in technologies, technology adoption as well, and at the same time, how can we create incentives so they can shift to alternative livelihoods, but with a reality check, because you know you cannot grow pineapples and if there are no proper roads to take them outside to the markets. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think several people have commented about trying to incentivize change. Everybody agrees you have to make it make sense to people's livelihoods, give people resilience and robust livelihoods and opportunities. How do we incentivize change rather than impose it? I think has been mentioned several times. I think there was another question at the back. Yes, there is. Thank you.
Hello, this is Andrea Jose. I am from Peru. And you've been talking a bit about Peru. I am a Peruvian business owner within the jewelry and industry, and I work with the artisanal mining communities together with Pure Earth in the Peruvian Amazon. And when we talk about environment, actually my company is a B Corp. So one of the main questions that we have as B Corps when we're getting certified, you know, is always taking care about the people, about the environment. But I'd like to address this question, for Rebecca and Sherry, and also if you would like to answer as well. Like, how do you find the right balance of taking care of the environment and all the environmental part, the environmental investments, whilst also having a balance with investment that needs to be given to the communities, to the social work within the communities? Because as you mentioned, Sherry, it's putting the people at the center at the end. We take care of the environment so that people can thrive within the environment. So I think this could be challenging because, of course, environmental issues seem very attractive and really amazing, but also people in communities that are located in Peru, in mining areas, they still like a lot of, main needs or basic things, as education, for example, no? So how do you create that right balance to really create that sustainable model? Of course, for a multinational, it's a completely different perspective, and for other companies that are smaller or medium sized, it's different, but yeah, I'd like to have a bit of your perspective, how you're coping with this.
So does anybody want to?
Do you want to go
Shall
first,
we?
Sherry?
I can start. Yeah, sure. Thanks for your question. Glad to know you're there in the room from Peru. I think, and John mentioned it too, we have to really think holistically about solutions, not just so narrowly. But I do think what I'm seeing our communities do when it comes down to climate resilience and adaptation, it's really about livelihoods. And if people can get by and make ends meet, and we can introduce new technologies or innovate ways of thinking, but people are benefiting and they're seeing opportunity, it works. If we try and force something and people aren't asking for it and there's not really a livelihoods connection, because that's really to that incentive. And I think when we look at vulnerable communities and impacts of climate, we've got to get to that livelihoods piece. And I have another really cool example that came out of my visit to Peru, which again, it's a bit of a biodiversity story, but I think also a livelihood story. We have a project called the Green Footprint, where we started planting trees, and the target now is 1.7 million trees. This is a lot of forestry. And originally they wanted to do 400 hectares, and they're up to 1,500. So it's amazing. It's like really taken off. We went out and visited with some of the farmers. These people are very rural. They're in a really highlands area, and people traditionally didn't plant trees, didn't harvest lumber. Like that was not something that happened. but there is, somebody locally had brought in trees and started this project, and then the community, we started this community project doing it. And what was really cool when we met with the community is they're starting to collect water. It's starting to get groundwater now on the hillside because the trees are collecting that water coming down. They're also now growing mushrooms under the trees. It's helping the trees grow, and now they're harvesting mushrooms. They're selling mushrooms. They've got a new crop. They're also harvesting timber and then replanting trees. And they're also just getting some environmental protection from wind and the elements that come from planting trees. So it sounds like something very simple of planting trees. The community is really enthusiastic about it, and people start to see that. And they're like, oh, you've got water locally now, and you're selling mushrooms, you're doing these things. Other people start to repeat that. So it's a great biodiversity story, but it's also working because it's about livelihoods. It's making people's lives better. It's giving them more resources, making them more resilient. So again, not really kind of the story I expected to see or hear, but that's what happens. And then we're also talking to the municipality of Cajamarca to how do we support green spaces in the urban area. So we have a commitment to plant 32 hectares of trees in the urban area as well, because I think shade comes back again to the heat story. But those are all strategies that, you know, it's innovative. It's maybe it's not something that had been done. So how do we introduce, that's where I think we have that role to kind of educate, facilitate, bring people together, help solve problems, but you do the stuff that people are requesting and asking for, not, imposing it on others, so.
Thanks a lot. We're getting the time signal. Sure. Do you want a quick comment? Or
Yeah, just
one more question as well.
Quickly, I would just say this is why we have, this is where I would also call attention to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And so thinking about, for old school sustainability people, or not so old school, we talk about materiality, right? What's a material impact to the business? The UNGPs say it's not just about the risk to business, it's about the risk to people. And so ultimately you're looking at, what I like about the UNGPs is that everyone has a role to play. Government has a role to play, business has a role to play, they both have a role to play in, you know, remedying harms. But from the business perspective and looking at potential or actual adverse impacts, you really want to look at where are the greatest impacts to people through your operations and activities? Where are they most severe and where are they most likely? And that kind of creates a roadmap. So the nice thing, and I love to hear your question, Andrea Jose, but I think the nice thing is that we can't do all things, but we can prioritize according to that framework. And there's a lot of social and environmental, and like they're kind of all mixed together, and it really has to do with the impact to people at the end of the day. So I would just say UNGPs all the way.
We're out of time. I think I'm getting the signal.
Oh, sorry.
There's one question. Could you make it a quick question, please? Yeah. Thank you.
I guess like in thinking about like a just or equitable transition, one could argue that a lot of the times when we're producing or manufacturing in the global south, these nations and communities didn't necessarily have an opportunity to have an industrial revolution for 200 years without being called out for climate change. And so I feel like most of us, hopefully in the room, and also most of us in the industry will agree on decarbonization. But when it comes to figuring out who's responsible for that, there's a lot of discourse on it. So I guess I'm wanting opinions on like, where does responsibility lie? If it is the for-profit sector, as like the majority of their emissions are in scope 3, what does that look like? And how do you, I guess, get that internal buy-in from other individuals within the company that aren't necessarily so integrated within sustainability?
It's a big one.
Sorry.
That would probably take us another hour. Does anybody want to take up one element of that? Because, okay.
I'll just say one thing. Does anybody here, because this keeps coming up, it is about people's lives. They need to raise their children, have clean water and food, and they need livelihoods, and just like everybody here. So I've heard a lot of people say who's taking responsibility. Does anybody here think it's the people who've been suffering the most, that are the smallest actors that don't have access to technology, that are just trying to make does anybody here think it's their fault? Because we might be able to clear this up right now.
So Kip's found the solution. I think it's our responsibility, it's all our responsibilities, and we know that there's the burden of history, resides on some of our shoulders. So that burden should really enervate us to say, what are we doing? What are our companies doing? What can we do? I will, because I'm being told to finish. I'll leave on a positive. There are opportunities to change business as usual and change business for the better, as well as more resilient livelihoods, more equitable distribution. Even electricity will be more equitably distributed if we start to move. So there are opportunities for positive change. We just have to embrace them.
And there's a human rights panel also
there's-
today,
yes, there is,
which
sorry.
would be a wonderful place to like take up this conversation, no?
Great.
With Estelle and
Okay.
great. And
It's coming next. So thank you for your time. Sorry we overran, but thank you again for your time and good questions. And my panelists.
I want to listen to like a webinar. I was like, oh,